Okay, welcome to Bio 104, and this is the non-majors intro bio class. And this is a great class for me to teach. I love teaching non-majors. I feel like science is very important, especially these days. We have a lot of distrust of scientists out there in our society, and I just realized that science has contributed so much to our understanding of our health, of our safety, and so we need to be able to trust scientists. And so our first lecture, I don't think there are any reading questions for, but the lecture is about what science is and what the characteristics of living things. Okay, there's a picture of a boat. I don't know why that's there, per se. Let's see. Okay, so as quick outline, what we're going to be talking about, again, we're going to talk about what is science, a little bit more in depth about the scientific process, how we acquire knowledge through this process of science. I'm going to give you an example of how the process has worked with regards to a very specific topic. We will talk about what is life, sort of defining living things. It's not really as easy as it seems. Okay, science. Really, this is a process. People think of it as being a bunch of static books, dusty books on the shelf. Those are the products of this process. This is the process really that has allowed us to prosper as a species, Homo sapiens. All right, and so the idea is to understand and discover the nature of things. I'm a scientist, curious kid, always interested in understanding and questioning about things. Science, probably one of the most common comments I hear from people when they come into this class is, well, I'm not good at science. I'm not really a science person. And I hope that you will change your mind after the semester and you realize that really science is for everybody, and that really one of the, I think, the challenges is just that it comes with its own language. Okay, science, that is, right? And so I put here a few words that you will see again and again if you get into biology or get into sciences. And these are usually Latin or Greek root words. And again, when you know a few of these root words, you can start to anticipate or predict what things mean. Like, for example, right, a bryozoan, if you know that bryo means moss in Latin, and that zoa or zoology means animals, then you could see that word and come up with a prediction that it's going to be some kind of mossy animal, which is exactly what it is. So you should know these root words. Just make yourself some flashcards and go through and memorize these. Okay. But the point here is, don't be intimidated by the language. Okay. Once you understand some of the vocabulary, then the concepts are really not that difficult. Okay, as a process, right, it's about evidence. So scientists acknowledge or accept or spend their time talking about ideas that have the most evidence, right? Science as a whole is going to pick the simplest answer or explanation, right? So gathers evidence and provides the simplest, most logical explanation to observed phenomenon. So some phenomenon that is observed, whether it be astrological in the heavens or health-wise, something we see ecological that has no explanation, then that's what science does, is it uses this process to gather evidence for the best explanation for that phenomenon. Okay, so really, again, we start with a question. in this case, we're talking about some observed phenomenon. We have a question about it. What causes this virus that is killing people? What is causing this algal bloom that is killing fish? What, there's a million questions you can think of. As a process, science is transparent, has to be transparent, or it breaks down. What we're talking about here is scientists need to be able to check up on each other, right? You can't just say that this is the most logical explanation for an observation and leave it at that. You need to be able to explain the experiments you did. You need to be able to tell somebody how to replicate those experiments so that they can check up on your work and make sure that you are doing good work, right? And we see this again and again, how humans are at the heart of this process, and humans are egocentric and greedy and make mistakes. And so we need a way to have transparency so that we can, as a community of scientists, check up on each other and make sure that we're all doing the best work we can. Because it's not flawless, right? We often, even when we start putting a lot of energy into understanding a phenomenon, there are always limitations, okay? And COVID-19 is a perfect example. We have learned a bunch in 7 months. This virus just emerged within 7 months, less than a year. There are still things we don't understand about smallpox or the flu of 1918, and science is continuing to gather evidence. But COVID-19 is a new phenomenon. We've learned a lot, but there's still a lot to learn. And people have to be comfortable to say, just because we don't have evidence for or against something, right, doesn't mean that science is at fault, right? Science should not be dogmatic, right? Dogma is to say, this is the truth, this is the case, it's set in stone. We don't question results, right? That's basically the opposite of what science. Science needs to be flexible. We'll talk about some examples. If scientists become dogmatic and they say this is the truth, then science is going to either slow or stop, right? Any explanation for a phenomenon is always on the table for further testing, right? That's a real common misconception, is that once something is, for example, evolution. We're going to talk about evolution in this class, and there's a lot of misconceptions that everybody just goes along and with this idea that once it becomes written down as a theory, that's the end. But in reality, scientists love to disprove each other, and they love to tear each other down, right? And so really anything that is out there in the scientific realm that's published is still always up for questioning, right? Cannot be dogmatic. It's important when we come up with an explanation for something we observe that we need to be able to understand the mechanism that explains that observation, right? So phenomena are subject to and can be explained by physical and chemical processes or mechanisms. Okay, so we need to be able to understand and explain how something happens, right? So the example here in this picture is how was the Grand Canyon formed. The mechanism there is as simple as erosion. It is water moving and picking up the stone and then grinding down other stone, right? So in this way, science is limited, okay? Science cannot tell us about the supernatural. Science cannot be used. This process we use for discovering the truth about things cannot be used to disprove God. It can be used to prove God. It can't be used to prove or disprove ghosts or anything that falls outside of the natural realm, okay? So supernatural, that's just off the table, okay? What evidence could we possibly gather that would disprove the existence of God, or that would prove the existence of God? Okay, so in that way, these are two separate things, and that's okay. We need to be comfortable with that. Okay, but again, the idea here is explaining the underlying physics or chemistry for a phenomenon. Okay, so alternatively, so again, this is sort of maybe think of it as the opposite of science. This is not any worse. It's not any better. It's just different way of explaining things, right? So if we see something, we see somebody gets healed, we see a earthquake, we see any phenomenon that can be observed could be explained using a vitalistic or supernatural worldview, to say that there are miracles at play, that it happened at the hands of a ghost or at the hand of an angel, right? But the issue here is, and it's not an issue with the worldview, it's an issue with science, right? These forces are not repeatable, they're not predictable, they're not measurable, right? And so in that way, science is just limited, right? We have no way to test these hypotheses, okay? We can't disprove them, and so therefore we can't test them, okay? Science, we're going to see, is all about disproving, right? Rarely do we prove anything in science, and this is a really important philosophical point. Okay, so say we make an observation. Okay, Wuhan, China, December 2019. People are developing sicknesses, they are developing respiratory issues, and they're dying. Question is, what's causing this virus, right? Or what's causing the disease, right? And of course, we figure out it's a virus. People are able to isolate the virus. They're able to culture the virus in cells. They're able to sequence the nucleic acid inside of the virus and figure out that it's a type of coronavirus. Okay, and so one of the biggest questions that came up was, how do we prevent the spread of the virus? How is the virus spread? Okay, viruses can be spread through the air, airborne. They can be spread on surfaces. They can be spread through feces. They can be spread sexually, right? And so all of these become possible answers to the question. The question being, how do we spread the virus? Okay, so these hypotheses are just possible answers to the question. Okay, and now for us to learn which is the right answer, we provide or perform experiments, right? But it's not really quite that simple, because we perform experiments, but we also just use anecdotal observations, right? We systematically go about investigating this situation and look for evidence that are going to reject these hypotheses, right? And so as the virus spreads and we look at the way it spreads, that seems to cut out the idea that it's sexually transmitted, because it's spreading way too fast to be sexually transmitted. People that are not engaging in intercourse with each other are getting the virus. So we can reject that hypothesis. Again, you would expect, if something is spread through feces, to spread in a specific way from one specific person to another. We're not seeing that evidence, so we reject that hypothesis. Right? We start winnowing down to a couple of hypotheses, right? And so I guess probably when it first came to the United States, the two main competing hypotheses were airborne transmission through respiratory droplets and surface transmission, right? And so some experiments could be completed there. You might have read about some of these experiments in a hospital setting. They know this person is infected. They can sample the air around that person. They can sample the air in the hallways and look for evidence of the virus. They could do experiments looking on surfaces at a certain distance away from the person, see how many particles of the virus were there, right? But again, a lot of this just became anecdotal. You'll read about the restaurant in China, and how people were sitting within a certain distance of the person that was known to be infected, and looking at the way the air moved, and then you see who is getting infected, or the church choir in Washington, and how people got infected there. And again, the unique thing about that situation was people were singing. It's a more forceful exhalation. You're causing a lot of respiratory droplets to be ejected into the air, right? And so through this careful observation, scientists were able to really figure out that the most important way that this virus is spread is through our breath, right? And so that leads to policies, that leads to procedures, that leads to social distancing, leads to masks being required at Walmart, right? Great example of how science is so important and useful, right? And that we need to be able to reject hypotheses, right? So again, we don't prove things. It's still not proven that surface transmission is not important, right? We can support, there's a lot of support for the idea that the most important way that the virus is spread is through our breath, right? There's a lot of support that masks are effective at reducing transmission, okay? It's not proven that masks reduce transmission, and some people hear that and they say, well, then I'm not going to wear a mask. But again, we have to look and see. This is a very recent and new kind of phenomenon. We have to be able to say, here's what the evidence suggests, and I'm comfortable with that. Okay, we're going to, again and again, we're going to revisit this idea that things are not proven, right? It's usually more about probability. You can reduce the probability of transmission by up to 80% in a lot of cases. It's another cool experiment, or it's not an experiment, a study that was done in China in households with a known infected person. If that person that was infected wore a mask, 80% reduction in transmission of the virus, right? That's not to say the 20%, that's, still too much. But, and some people will say, well, then I'm not wearing a mask. But the point is, it reduces the probability greatly, right? A hypothesis, if you're going to come up at the beginning of the experiment, if you want to come up with a possible answer to the question, you need to be able to define a way to refute that answer. We need to be able to reject that answer. If an answer is not rejectable at the beginning of the experiment, it is not a good answer. Therefore, it's not a good hypothesis, right? So again, there's all different levels of support, and scientists have to be able to communicate that uncertainty, right? We have to be able to say, I'm not exactly certain, but maybe I'm 50% certain, which is still better than totally uncertain in my mind. Right? See what this woman is doing here. Not a common process anymore, but in the past, this is sort of removing the wheat from the chaff. This is the process called winnowing. And when you pick grains, they have a little hull around them that's inedible, and inside of that is the little kernel of the grain, whether it's rice or it's wheat. And so to remove that, you go on a windy day, you have a basket, maybe you throw the grains up in the air, the wind takes away the chaff, takes away the inedible part, and then the grains that are edible fall down. Okay, and so I really like this as an idea. We start with a whole bunch of ideas, right? Because we want to know the answer. But we have to have a starting point as for what the answer is. So we start out with a whole bunch of hypotheses. We go through this experiment. We're removing the ones that either the evidence suggests they're untrue, and as we go through the process, we get closer and closer to that little nugget of truth. Okay, another common, really this is semantics, it seems. One of my pet peeves, I hear on the radio all the time, people talking about a theory that X or Y or Z. What they really should be saying is a hypothesis. Okay, Right now there is a hypothesis that people who have been exposed to certain cold viruses in the past have some level of immunity to the coronavirus. This is another observation that is being made. 100 people get the virus, some people die, some people are asymptomatic carriers, and then there's everything in between. How is that? Really, really interesting and important question. Okay, and so we start with the hypothesis that there's some learned and acquired immunity to the virus existing, right? And if you take a hypothesis and you do the experiment, it is supported, it's not rejected, and then you approach that hypothesis from a slightly different angle, and we test some other different aspect of it, and it is supported, and it's not rejected. And through this process, if you find that the hypothesis continues to be supported and that there are other hypotheses that are seemingly related, that at the end you can come up with what's called a theory. Right? It's very well tested. If something is not just a theory, by the time it becomes a theory in science, it is very well tested and supported. Okay, so this is not perfect, but it works pretty well. Okay, take medicine for an example. I'm so glad that I did not have to live. I mean, I'd love to live 1,000 years ago in many ways, but I am a nervous wreck about my children. This is the first day at school right now. I worry about their health. Can you imagine having children before there were antibiotics? I just can't conceptualize it. We have things like the Journal of American Medical Association. It helped us to really come a long way and to live much healthier lives, right? It's much better than saying that there's some little gremlin living in your lungs that are causing the illness, right? Okay, science of biology. Okay, bio means life. The logy or ology part is about, again, using this process of science to study living things, right? Study their function, their growth, studying ecology, zoology, bacteriology, all those different subdivisions. Okay. I'm going to give an example of the scientific process and how our perception has changed. Okay, the question here being, what is the relationship between human health and bacteria, little single-celled organisms that live all around us? They're on your skin, they're on the table, they're on this computer, they're on that every place. Okay, and what is the relationship here? And so at first, of course, if you go way back, what made people sick? Certainly people didn't think it was bacteria. Why? Because there was really no idea that bacteria even existed. And largely we can substitute bacteria for viruses here too. Although let me go back real quick. Forgot to say this. Oh no, wait, I haven't got there yet. Never mind. Sorry. So what caused health issues was demonic possession. Again, maybe there's some type of demon living inside of your body, and so the question being, how do we heal this? And that would require some type of religious figure, a shaman, a priest. Now, what does science say about this? Nothing. Right? We can't disprove that. We can't prove that. Okay. Is there demonic possession? There's no way to test that. We can't really make a statement on that. However, what we do know is that there are cases where people are sick, and we can point to other explanations that are certainly related. Until the 1880s, what caused things like smallpox, leprosy, and malaria, shown on the slide here, right? The idea, the theory was called the miasma theory, and the idea here is that there's rotting matter in these cities, and that is rotting organic matter like dead bodies, garbage, things like that, cause these polluted air columns, and that the polluted air, or the miasma, is what leads to the illness. Okay, and these miasmas, move around cities, and they carry the stale air with them, and then they cause all these different diseases. Okay. So how do you deal with this? Well, then you clean up the city. You make sure that there's not garbage laying around in the alleys. This is actually one of the major reasons why people began to be cremated, was because they thought that if dead bodies are rotting, they may be giving off miasmas and causing diseases. Okay, so that's 1880s, about the time that Reinhardt was formed. This, if you got smallpox or malaria, this is the reason, right? But you can see a supernatural type of interaction in both of these, which makes these impossible to really test, right? Now, along comes this Ignaz Semmelweis, which I think he was a Hungarian guy. He was a physician, and he worked in a maternity ward. And what he noticed was that we can see on the graph here, puerperal fever we know now is caused by bacteria, and we see mortality rates, and these are of women after giving childbirth. Up to 30%, 1 in 3 women died after giving childbirth, right? And what Dr. Semmelweis found, he found this relationship. You see in about 1847 that the mortality rate drops down and hovers below 5%, right? So that's 25% reduction in mortality. And the thing that happened was that he started to use chlorinated hand wash between deliveries, right? Again, now it seems like, of course, we wash our hands well after delivering one baby before you deliver another. But at the time, again, what caused puerperal fever? Those things, whatever the hell that is, right? So Semmelweis says that's not true, right? But here's a great example of how science is not perfect, right? Because if science is not dogmatic and scientists are not dogmatic, then we get new evidence and quickly we'll change our mind, right? But instead, all these doctors kind of made fun of him. They said, we're doctors, we're the men, we're powerful, we can do whatever we want to. I'm not dirty, right? Couldn't possibly be me. I don't need to wash my hands. And so actually Semmelweis died, a poor man, in an insane asylum because he had a nervous breakdown. It was later on that people started to revisit his ideas and say, oh, he might have been onto something there. This is by far certainly not the whole story of, how we've learned all this. I'm not even going to talk about Louis Pasteur, but another important one, Robert Koch. He was a German guy, and his contribution was he figured out for things like tuberculosis that there is a specific type of bacteria, right? So Semmelweis's idea suggested that if we use these type of hand washes, that we must be killing some living things on our hands, right? And then von Leeuwenhoek came and said, yeah, there are little tiny things that are microscopic. Robert Koch then picked up on that, and he said there are a specific type of microorganism, which we know now is a type of bacteria, that causes tuberculosis, and that there's a separate and different type of bacteria that causes smallpox, and likewise for any type of disease. Well, most types of diseases, right? And he also figured out ways to culture them and started to learn about things like vaccines, right? So this really changed. In a few short decades, we shifted our thinking greatly, right? And that really has saved millions of lives, right? So from the understanding that specific bacteria cause illnesses, really, and that led to vaccines, that led to the discovery of penicillin in the 30s or 40s. And so then there was sort of an all-out war against bacteria, and then you get, crazy hand washing, wipes, total sanitation in households, Lysol, all these things, with the idea being to reduce the levels of those microorganisms and we will have less disease. Now, really, you flash forward, and these little diagrams I've got on here, probably from 2009, so 11 years ago. And now we're really starting to take our understanding of bacteria and human health much further, and understanding that this is a much more complex situation. Okay, on the right of the slide here, we see a map of human body, and we see all these different types of bacteria. So your armpit and your butt crack and the back of your head and behind your ear and the bottom of your feet, inside of your mouth, certainly your nose, sinuses, the vaginal tract, have very entirely different communities of bacteria living in them. And that we now know that if they're not living there, there are some major health problems that come about as the result of those bacterial communities getting out of whack, right? The microbiome, human microbiome, infinitely fascinating, right? We've seen that a lot of times allergies are caused by a imbalance in the microbiome. Obesity, right? Sort of inexplicable. Some people can eat the same amount of food and same type of food as another person and be totally obese, right? The way our body metabolizes fats, carbohydrates, and then decides what to do with them, whether it will store them as fat or whether it doesn't, really a lot of that is determined by the bacteria that live in our intestines. Diabetes, there seems to be some relationship between whether you become diabetic or not and your microbiome. Crohn's disease, C. diff, Clostridium difficile, horrible bacterial infection that appears if you have very harsh antibiotics. You could maybe wipe out the microbiome in your gut, and then that vacuum is filled by this species of bacteria called Clostridium difficile, and a lot of people die from C. diff. It's really horrible. You just basically have diarrhea until you're dead. IBS, even mental health. A lot of our neurotransmitters that determine our mood are actually not produced by our body, but by the bacteria in your gut, right? Depression. We don't really know where this ends, right? And how much this is going to impact the future of health. Imagine the time, well, you don't have to imagine the time. Right now, if people get C. diff or IBS, there's almost nothing that can be done for that person, right? You can try to wipe out those bad bacteria with antibiotics, but that's sort of how we got here in the first place. So what's turning out to be the most effective means of treating C. diff, and you'd have to have had C. diff for this to seem like a palatable, reasonable thing to do, but you take the feces from one person and you take their poo and you wash it, you do different things to prepare it. You make what's called a fecal suppository, and then you put it in another person's rectum, and then that will help to repopulate their gut biome with healthy bacteria, and they're healed, right? Yeah. So, but that said, again, is bacteria good or bad for us? Yes and no. It is good, it's bad. Antibiotics are good up to a certain point until they start wiping out our good bacteria, right? So we don't know what a healthy microbiome looks like. We don't know how we're starting to understand that our diet affects the microbiome, but we don't really know. Can we correct the microbiome when it is sort of imbalanced, right? All things that now that said, we may have the answers now. Science is working very, very quickly, and so a lot of these questions that I wrote down a few years ago, check it out, read up on it. Microbiome, really interesting. Okay, last thing I want to talk about is just what is the definition of a living thing? How do we know that something is alive? Okay, and so what we see is living things are always made of cells. There's some order, right? Life is cellular by definition. Cells organize into tissues, and a bunch of muscle cells as a tissue act differently than individual muscle cells do. Tissues organize into organs, organs into organ systems, into organisms, populations, communities, the biosphere, right? And so we see this organization, different levels, and that is really a characteristic of living things. Non-living things don't do that. Living things are sensitive to their environment. They have to be able to sense different temperatures, salinity, pHs, and a lot of times this results in movement away from or towards different things in the environment. Living things grow. They develop, right? So as humans go from a single-celled zygote to a blastula to an embryo to an infant, right? There's a really specific and predictable order in which these things happen. That's called development. Living things have the ability to produce other living things. In fact, all living cells came from a pre-existing living cells, right? Living things gather energy, and then they utilize the energy to do work inside of their cells, right? Plants use sunlight to take carbon dioxide and build sugar, and then they take that sugar and they basically oxidize or burn it and make ATP, and then you use the ATP to open their leaves, to move, to transport things within their body, right? So we have this metabolism or energetics. All living things evolve, right? Evolution and life are inextricably linked. If you have living things that, and we'll talk again a lot more about this, but suffice to say, adaptation is it's an unavoidable side effect of being alive. Okay, and then finally, all living things undergo homeostasis. Living things respond and keep their internal environment at specific acceptable levels. Okay, things like body temperature, right? We can think of humans, body, let's see, amount of water, hydration, right? So if you drink too much water, then your kidneys remove that, put it into your bladder, and you urinate. If you don't have enough water, your body produces the sensation of being thirsty, and you drink. Salts, blood pressure, right? Lots and lots of examples, and we'll talk about some of these homeostasis. But these are the things, right, that define life. And so what I was going to say earlier was, by most people's definition, COVID-19 is not a living organism. Viruses are not alive. Number one, they're not cellular, right? They don't have made up of cells. They are not capable of reproduction on their own. They actually need to use our cells and our cellular machinery to reproduce. And they also don't have their own metabolism. Everything that they do that requires work, they rely on our cells. They sort of hijack our living cells to make new copies of them. And so that way, they're not alive. But it's kind of confusing because they do have nucleic acids. And so they do adapt, they do evolve over time. They do seemingly reproduce, unfortunately, but again, not independently of their own, right? So those are things that make viruses non-living. Okay, and so that's the end of lecture 1. Okay, next we're going to go on to our module about cancer. And so the next lecture you can expect to see is Cancer Module Lecture 1. Okay, thanks.